Well, we've referenced an article already that's on the website. We'll put it in the show notes. But in there's a really great checklist that I kind of want to walk through, Molly, and just get your kind of feedback on what to look for, what to be aware of as you go through drafting or reviewing an MSA. Maybe you have it pulled up. If not, I can kind of run through each one. But as we get into, let's maybe start with the term. What is something important when you're looking at a term for an MSA? We've kind of covered that a little bit already, but anything that we've missed?
No, I mean, you just want to be specific about it. And, again, it's whatever makes sense in a particular situation. It's not as much as the MSA is kind of a one size fits all a little bit, but you need to make sure it makes sense for the two companies that are entering into this MSA and what makes sense for that. And so you may have, in your company, you may have, say you have 5 MSAs. One may be 3 to 5 years. One may be in the perpetuity, although I'm with Brent. I don't love that. One may be for a year and one may be, for 6 years or something as far as that goes. It depends on what makes sense. It depends on what, kind of your needs are and everything. But it should have a term that is in there that is defined and not so long as services are being provided is a little bit is our recommendation, simply because it gets very vague. It's very, if they buy a part from you, does that count? These types of things, and it can be binding even though you don't intend it to be. So
Mm,
just put a number in there. I think most folks are pretty reasonable about that, but just put a number in there.
mm.
Yeah.
Brett, do you see an
Yeah.
advantage to going shorter or longer in term?
I mean, there's not an issue with going long. It's a matter if you go too short, then you're potentially, you get into working and you're active and you're just in the business, the flywheel of what you're doing with that company, and you just kind of sight unseen, you forget about it. So you don't want it to be burdensome from a maintenance standpoint. But again, you don't want it to be in
Mm,
perpetuity. And so I like personally that 3 to 5 years. I could throw a calendar, reminder on my calendar 5 years from now, and it'll pop up one day, and hopefully we're still around, and I can call
yeah.
somebody and show them how responsible we are to monitor our MSAs. Um, yeah, so I guess the next one is scope of work. And, I can take that from our standpoint. It's
Sure.
pretty important. And the reason being, at least in our boilerplate MSA, and really kind of what the standard industry, landman industry non-compete is, typically goes something like this. 12 months from the date services are completed under a given work order. You won't negotiate for purchase, leases, minerals, royalties, whatever, on the lands that are subject to this service agreement or subject to a work order. Basically, what they're trying to achieve, and rightfully so, is you're not going to receive confidential information about a prospect area, work it on their behalf, receive payment on their behalf, and then come back and either A, work it for another company, a competing company at a later time, or go in there and buy minerals under their project. You receive a tremendous amount of confidential information on these projects, and the company needs to ensure that they're protected from you going and competing against them with their own information and know-how. So that's the boilerplate of what you see. And there's some nuance there. We always try to expand on that to account for scope of work, and really define what the creation of a non-compete area is. And that scope of work is a big part of that. If you have those limitations, for instance, we don't want to create a non-compete for doing a lease check or doing a filing for you or a mail out over, an entire, water flood unit, for instance. That takes us 3 weeks. It's cursory in nature. We get a list, we mail some stuff out for you. We don't want to be subject to a non-compete over a large area. Due diligence is another example. These projects cover counties at times. We don't want to subject ourselves to that. So the scope of work is important because it should tie to if you have a well-drafted non-compete, scope should be an important part of that. There should be definitions of what's going to create that non-compete and what's not. So it's a big one for us. I jumped in on that one because it's important.
No, and you're absolutely right. And, look, at the end of the day, right, this is a contract. And, if and when things go wrong, courts are going to look at it and going to, the vague and ambiguous terms are going to be ruled against he who writes it. And so specificity and clearly defining the parameters in which the parties are able to work and operate in different things, it's very important. And that way everybody knows. I mean, Brett, you said it perfectly at the beginning. It's the rules of the game. I'll play any game you want me to play. I just need to know what the rules are. And everybody needs to play by the same rules, because then we know how to move forward and what's going to happen. And so it's just setting those parameters and being very clear about it and being very intentional about it. And, I'm a firm believer that your contract, you should mean what you say what you mean. And if you mean it to apply to this project for this work for, much what Red's talking about, but not for, I need you to mail out some notices. Let's put that in there. Let's make sure that we're clear about what it is that we're talking about, so that everybody knows where we're going and everybody knows what the rules are.
Yeah, that's
Certainly.
great.
We could dive into that a little bit more.
Yeah.
Typically, you see that in the confidentiality portion is where you see non-compete. Can expand on that when we get to it a little more.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of kind of the rules of the game, and knowing what you're trying to achieve, performance metrics is also another area in the MSA that we want to review. What are some things that we're looking to really be clear about in the performance metrics section?
I mean, basically what's okay and what's not okay, of what it is that I'm expecting your work to provide to me. Now, look, I mean, particularly for landmen, if you're hunting down and trying to get, track title down and everything else, well, obviously you're only as good as the information that you get, right? And so it's that, but there should be some, parameters around that of what the expectation is. Did you Google John Smith, Shelby County, Texas, and say, well, there's nobody there, and move on? Or, well, there's 50 and I can't decide which one's which, so I'm out. There's some integrity that's involved in that, and it's what it is. But do you have to go knock on every door of every John Smith in the state of Texas? That's probably, but just setting your expectations and setting what it is that is acceptable work product, outside of, the industry norms and everything else. But if there's something specific that you're looking for, then put it in there.
Yeah, and we see it kind of in this. If you're looking at an MSA, I could see them in my sleep. They all kind of follow a rhythm, and that metrics that we see on the land-based MSAs is, things like we'll ensure that you have qualified independent contractors or qualified landmen with certain maybe levels of certification, or you'll follow best practices, or you will adhere to the code of ethics of the AAPL. Those kind of, we see those things oftentimes in that part of an MSA. They oftentimes, what you have to be careful about, and we didn't have in here, it's very warranted to add, there's the independent contractor employee relationship. That's a big deal in our space. And if you're not careful reading through these agreements, they'll plaster references to employees. Dudley Land Company will ensure that said person does this and does that. And by law, Department of Labor standards, there are things that I can't assure that a contractor is going to do, right?
Mhm.
It is not my responsibility to monitor it. And further, I cannot monitor it or I'm in violation, and I'm subject to penalty, and I'm treating that person like an employee instead of an independent contractor. So those are real important things to really study and make sure that you're not just signing off on, because, if your firm is big enough, one day you're going to be subject to an audit, Department of Labor audit, some kind of audit. They're going to look at those things, and they're going to look at all your MSAs and say, well, you signed off, and they'll use that against you, I guess. If you sign 15 MSAs that say you're going to treat everybody as such, that's an acknowledgement that you're treating those people as employees. So that's kind of one of the things to keep an eye out for from our perspective.
Yeah, and to that end, I'll just tag onto that real quick. The difference between independent contractor and employee is huge, from a legal perspective as well. Simply because, much like you're saying, you'll expose yourself or your company, when you don't have to. That's the reason you hire independent contractors. You hire somebody that knows what they're doing, and you can sort of reap the benefits of it. But you can't control. It's the manner, means, and details of their work, right? So saying, I need you to go do this on this particular tract of land, that's not controlling it. If you're out there and say, okay, now you need to do this, now go to the courthouse, now look at these deeds, now go talk to this person, now do this, like, it gets
Yeah.
blurry. And so, a little bit, at the beginning, when you talk about the definitions and how things are defined at the beginning of the MSA, make that very clear. But Best practices on my end is to not have a, employee means independent contractor, borrowed servant, like all of these sort of classifications. You want to continue to be very clear about independent contractor, independent contractor, independent contractor.
Yeah. And most of the MSAs have caught up with that, right?
Yeah.
Companies have realized, hey, these are independent contractors. I want to make that very clear. So it's great. I've seen a big improvement over the last 15 years in that side of things, how this typically is drafted. But they'll slip some stuff in there on you if you're not careful.
That's it.